The slap cracked through the air with the hard, metallic sound of something striking marble. In that frozen instant, the entire federal courtroom in Chicago fell silent as Officer Ryan Foster's handprint blazed across the cheek of the woman standing at the witness podium. A sudden, brutal blow, one no one had seen coming. But what stunned the room even more wasn't the slap itself. It was how she rose from it. Ava Morgan didn't stumble, didn't cry, didn't retreat even half a step. She simply tilted her head, lifted two fingers to straighten the round glasses knocked askew on her nose, then looked up with eyes as cold and sharp as a thin blade. The red mark on her cheek flared like the imprint of an insult, yet her gaze was so calm it made the man standing before her swallow hard. Someone in the gallery let out a sharp breath, as if sensing Foster had just touched something he absolutely should not have touched. Ryan Foster. 38 years old, heir to 3 generations of law enforcement, stood before her breathing like an animal provoked. He believed he could read every type of person who entered this courtroom. But Ava didn't tremble, didn't talk back. She stood there with a steady, icy composure that sparked a nameless unease inside him. That unease ignited the fire he had been trying to smother for days. The fire of fear. The courtroom was full of stunned faces. Overhead lights reflected off the marble floor, casting Foster's rigid silhouette like a warped shadow. Whispers spread quickly a police officer had just slapped a witness in front of a federal judge. But the strange thing was, this woman didn't look like a victim. No one knew that seconds before the slap, she had been standing there like any ordinary expert presenting cold statistics on police misconduct. No one knew her true identity, and Foster certainly didn't. While Foster clenched his fists, breath-quickening, Ava felt time slow. Each heartbeat was distinct. Every movement in the courtroom seemed pulled into silence. She tasted a faint metallic tang at the corner of her lip, but in her mind there was only one thought. He just buried himself. Judge Harriet Cole jolted out of shock, hammering her gavel so hard it echoed. Her voice rang heavy, but it couldn't mask the disbelief in her eyes. A slap delivered in the middle of a hearing on police reform, with journalists filming every second and cameras capturing every breath. Foster knew that, but he had lost control long before this moment. He wasn't looking at Ava as an expert. He saw her as the one who had dared to expose years of his wrongdoing. A cold accusation he didn't know how to face except through violence. Ava stood tall, inhaled deeply, then slowly bent to pick up her fallen glasses. Her fingers touched the cool metal frame, but inside she felt only the heat of restrained fury, not because of the slap, but because of the blind arrogance standing before her. She felt the crowd behind her, the shock, the helplessness, and the quiet anticipation of something about to happen. Foster stepped back half a pace, then forward again, as if unsure whether to advance or retreat. His thoughts were chaotic, like shattered glass. He couldn't understand why she wasn't afraid, why someone so small could stand so calmly. He assumed she was some city academic who talked more than she acted. He didn't know Ava Morgan had worn a uniform for 8 years, had led teams in war zones, had taken down men twice her size in fights without referees. He didn't know about the Bronze Star tucked in her drawer or the classified files she once decrypted on duty. And most importantly, he didn't know who she was inside the federal government. Ava lifted her gaze and locked eyes with Foster. In that look, there was no fear. Only a silent sentence, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The room remained utterly still until Ava raised her hand to adjust the microphone. Her voice, low and steady, dropped into the silence like a weight onto every chest. And in that moment, everyone understood this story had moved far beyond a slap. It had crossed into the domain of truth and consequence. Ava knew it. Foster didn't, but he was about to. Ava Morgan stepped away from the witness stand with a calm so chilling it seemed to thicken the air, while the entire courtroom was still numb from the slap moments earlier. No one understood why she didn't tremble. No one understood why her eyes still shone with clarity, instead of shattering under the humiliation of hundreds of watching faces. But Ava understood perfectly well. Everything was unfolding exactly as she had anticipated. She hadn't come here to be treated kindly. She came to expose a truth that many had buried for years. And the man who had just slapped her, Ryan Foster, was the most crucial link in the chain. The courtroom atmosphere turned heavy and suffocating. The warm yellow lights suspended high above cast down across tense faces, some furious, some horrified. Some were frightened that a police officer could strike someone inside a courtroom. Others were stunned by Ava's composure. And Foster, he was breathing hard, chest rising and falling like an animal cornered at the edge of a cliff. That slap hadn't freed him. It had pushed him further into the trap he had been digging for himself. When Ava stepped back, Foster instinctively stepped forward as if his instincts to attack were stronger than reason. But in that exact moment, the sharp metallic crack of the judge's gavel rang out. Judge Harriet Cole slammed it against the bench, each strike landing like a warning blow. Her stern face held both disappointment and alarm. She knew the situation was slipping out of control, and the most dangerous person in the room was not the victim. It was Officer Foster. Reporters at the back of the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Camera flashes burst like rapid lightning across a dark sky. Videographers adjusted their lenses, zooming in on Foster's face, flushed red, taut with fury, eyes wide with rage. They missed no detail. Every movement he made was being recorded, every breath, every grind of his teeth. And at the center of it all, Ava stood upright, steady, as a quiet line carved through chaos. Foster had been a police officer for more than 15 years. He believed he could read anyone. He believed he knew exactly who was scared, who was pretending to be strong, and who would break. But Ava was different. That difference drove him mad more than any accusation she made. In his eyes, she was an outsider, someone who didn't understand the harshness of the streets, someone who had never faced real criminals. He didn't know she had been in Fallujah, had held the lives of her team in her hands, on the battlefield, had made split-second decisions where a single moment of hesitation could cost someone their life. Those memories sat quietly like steel in her chest. But Foster would never see them. All he saw was a woman of color standing at a witness stand, daring to criticize police conduct. Ava picked up the stack of documents that had fallen from the stand. Her fingers tightened slightly around the thin edge of the paper, feeling its fragile texture, even though it held a weight of truths no one wanted to face. In this room, some people wanted reform. Some feared it. And then there was Foster, a man willing to attack anyone who touched the wall of power he had built around himself. She had understood that from the first day she read his file. In the public seating area, an older woman raised her hand to her mouth, whispering in fear. A law student beside her tried to swallow a curse under his breath. A reporter leaned toward a colleague, eyes locked on Foster. He's about to lose it completely. The words floated in the air like a prophecy. and Foster, as if hearing the prediction, stepped forward another half pace. He no longer saw Ava as an expert. He saw her as an enemy, as a shadow threatening to destroy everything he had hidden for years. All the internal calls, the insults on the radio, the times he had shoved a man to the ground, simply for asking why, Ava had all of it. Ava drew a slow, deep breath. She knew her presentation had to continue, even as the courtroom simmered like boiling water about to spill over. She knew every second was being filmed, and every action Foster took now would become evidence proof for the entire country that the problem wasn't just in the statistics, it was right there in the room. And when Ava reached out to adjust the microphone again, no one in the courtroom realized they were about to witness one of the defining moments in the history of police reform. Foster thought he had humiliated her. He didn't know the slap had been the opening note of a downfall. He could no longer stop. Ava knew. Outside observers were beginning to sense it. But Foster, the one person who needed to understand, continued walking forward as if he still had the right to strike again. And that blindness was what would carry him straight to the edge of the abyss. Ava Morgan paused beside the witness stand, drawing in a deep, steadying breath. The overhead lights cast a soft halo across her face, a quiet glow that contrasted sharply with the chaos simmering behind her. Her cheek still burned from the slap, yet her gaze hadn't dimmed. If anything, it was brighter, deeper, as if that strike had awakened a side of her Foster never imagined existed. And that was the beginning of a terrifying unraveling. On the large screen behind Ava, the report she had been presenting remained frozen on a particular page, a data table summarizing 7 years of complaints filed against the Chicago Police Department, with numerous entries marked in red. Every red highlight pointed directly to Ryan Foster. That red seemed to pulse like the heartbeat of the entire courtroom, the color of a truth buried for far too long. Foster stared at the screen, then at Ava. His face grew pale, but beneath that pallor flickered a wild, uncontrollable anger, the desperate rage of an animal cornered. His jaw tightened, muscles standing out sharply. Everything he had hidden, every threat whispered to weaker colleagues, every falsified report, every internal radio exchange dripping with bias, all of it was in her hands. And he knew she was about to reveal it in the one place where he had the least power to stop her. Ava lifted the thick stack of documents from the table, turning each yellowed page slowly. The soft rustle of paper felt like knives striking the polished wood. Every page was a story, a complaint, a wound left on innocent people. She had read them night after night until she knew every detail, every trembling voice on the recordings. But she wasn't reading for herself now. She was reading for the room, for those who had never dared look truth in the eye. The first page appeared a complaint, reporting that Foster had shoved a black teenager onto the pavement during a traffic stop. The boy's wrist had been broken. The case closed in 3 days for lack of evidence, but Ava had found the missing video clip, and in a moment she would play it. A sharp breath rose from the press section. A young reporter lifted her hand to her mouth, unable to hide her shock as she saw the number of complaints against Foster, so many they filled 2 full pages. Ava felt a wave of outrage ripple through the rows behind her, spreading fast like wind, sweeping through flags, during a parade swift, wide, and unstoppable. Foster stepped forward. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the words came out dry and brittle. "You are twisting the truth." All of these accusations were resolved. Internal affairs found no violations. Ava turned slowly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes weren't harsh or taunting, They were simply a mirror reflecting reality. Resolved or buried. A low murmur swept through the courtroom. Foster flinched. He wasn't used to being challenged publicly. For 15 years, whenever anyone questioned him, higher-ups shielded him with excuses about inaccurate data or complex circumstances. But today, there was no one standing behind him. Ava approached the projector. Then she pressed a button. The screen flickered and shifted. A body cam video appeared. The footage shook briefly, then steadied. Viewers saw Foster approach a silver car and knock on the window with the metal end of his flashlight. Inside, a boy around 16 trembled as he raised both hands. He clearly stated he was not resisting. Yet Foster yanked him out, turned him around, and slammed him onto the hood. A soft cry broke from someone in the courtroom. A woman covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Perhaps she was a mother who had lived through something similar. Foster snapped. "This footage lacks context." "You don't understand my job." Ava didn't look away from him. "I understand more than you think." That sentence made Foster retreat half a step. Only a heartbeat later did he grasp the implication behind her words. But before he could react, Ava turned toward the judge and continued flipping through the file. No one in the courtroom knew the woman standing before them had once been granted military clearance to review materials no police officer would ever touch. No one knew she had recovered internal audio files long believed erased. And most importantly, no one knew her true identity, a role she held in Congress, powerful enough to shift the entire system. Ava knew. Foster did not. And when she began speaking again, her voice soft, yet razor clear. The entire courtroom understood that the truth was only beginning to surface. Ava Morgan stood beside the witness stand like a still point in the middle of a storm that was growing larger by the second. Behind her, the projector screen shifted to a new data page where every line and every mark reflected one chilling truth. Patrol Unit Number 3. The unit where Ryan Foster had served for more than a decade had a rate of force usage more than 300% higher than the citywide average. Not only that the number of complaints involving discriminatory behavior in predominantly black neighborhoods far exceeded every other district. The courtroom lights seemed to flicker, reacting to the collective shock of the people inside. A young attorney on the left bench leaned toward his colleague voice, trembling with outrage, speaking softly but loud enough for several around him to hear, "This is an entire rotten system, not just Foster." And Ava heard it. She felt every whisper spreading across the room like embers ready to erupt into a wildfire. Foster, standing near the door in his usual position, could no longer maintain the disciplined posture of a trained officer. He tugged at his collar, shifted restlessly, his breathing quick and uneven. He had believed he was the one controlling this hearing. But now he looked like a man sitting on a barrel of gunpowder with the lid ripped off. Everyone knew he was about to explode. And it was Ava who had struck the match. Ava continued speaking in a steady, level tone, not loud and not soft, but every word dropped like a stone into a still lake. In the past 3 years, predominantly, black neighborhoods have recorded a surge in baseless stops with a rate more than 300% higher than other areas. These numbers do not appear in the unit's official reports, but they do appear in data collected from city cameras, hospital records, and witness statements. Each sentence tightened another loop of the rope winding around Foster's neck. The more he listened, the harder it became for him to breathe, though no one had laid a hand on him. People behind him began raising their phones toward him, recording the moment the accuser inside the courtroom transformed into the one being judged. A silver-haired pastor, seated in the middle row, slowly shook his head, eyes glistening with emotion. He had watched generations of black residents in his neighborhood suffer injustice, but he had never seen anyone stand in a federal courtroom and speak directly into a police officer's face the way Ava was doing now. He whispered, "God sent you here, child." Foster heard it. He turned sharply, staring at Ava, and for a brief instant, his eyes revealed something no one had ever seen on him before: fear. Not because she was accusing him, but because he could not understand who she was, and Foster could never tolerate the unknown. Ava continued this time with a deliberate edge. In several cases listed as insufficient evidence, key materials disappeared from the original files. But we have extracted copies from the central system, and according to those files, she pressed a button. The screen flashed white before switching to an internal audio clip. Foster's voice, arrogant and dripping with contempt, rang out clearly. "3 black kids. Usually ones like that are trouble. Check them fast and see if we can get something to charge them with." A wave of outrage swept across the courtroom. A young mother, perhaps the parent of a teenage boy, burst into tears. A lawyer slammed his hand against his knee, grinding out the words, "I cannot believe he said that," over official police radio. Foster panicked and jabbed a finger toward the screen. "That is edited. There is no context. You cannot use that." To Ava turned toward him, her gaze sharp as steel. "The context is you, Officer Foster, and what you just displayed is also the context." Silence fell heavy and absolute, spreading outward like the cracking of ice under the weight of winter. Foster was sweating now. He had lost the ability to predict what Ava would reveal next. Every cell in his body screamed that he had to stop her by any means necessary. But he failed to realize that the more he struggled, the deeper he sank into the trap built from data he could no longer deny. Ava stepped toward the judge's bench, her voice soft, but each word drilling into the air. "And now, Your Honor, I will present the most serious section of the entire file." The courtroom held its breath, and Foster, standing there like a man at the edge of a cliff, had no idea which curtain Ava was about to pull back. But he knew one thing: whatever lay behind that curtain could end his entire career. And Ava, the woman he thought was just an ordinary expert witness, was the one holding the scissors. Ava Morgan opened the next case file, the soft rustle of paper sounding less like a movement of documents and more like the creak of a coffin lid being pried open. The courtroom fell utterly silent, the only sound the cold airflow from the vents sweeping through the long wooden benches. No one blinked. No one dared breathe too deeply. They knew what was coming would be the heaviest blow yet, and Ava knew she was moments away from firing the shot that would end Ryan Foster's career. She touched a small silver USB drive, then inserted it into the projector port. The screen burst into light. The glow washed across Foster's cheek, exposing the panic trembling beneath his skin. He no longer stood upright like a man in authority. He hunched forward, hands clenched so tightly it looked as if releasing them would cause his entire body to collapse. The projector displayed a body cam video crystal clear with no shaking and no cuts. A young man sat in his car, both hands properly placed on the steering wheel. His voice was respectful as he said, "Sir, I am reaching for my registration. You can watch my hands." Then the camera turned toward the passenger door. Ryan Foster appeared. He opened the passenger side door, leaned in, and slipped his hand into his own pocket. A small plastic bag of white powder appeared in his palm. He dropped it onto the passenger seat as casually as tossing a piece of candy. and his voice followed calm and icy. "And what is this? Where are you taking it?" A choked gasp erupted from somewhere in the gallery. A man in the back row buckled at the knees, gripping the bench in front of him, mouth open, eyes burning with outrage. A female reporter pressed her hand to her chest as if checking whether her heart was still beating. And in the far corner, an elderly former officer shook his head. Slowly, grief etched into every line on his face. That is the worst thing a cop can do. But the one who reacted most violently was Foster. He shouted, his voice cracking apart. "No, no! That is impossible! You edited that! You cannot have that footage!" Ava turned her head. She did not raise her voice. She did not spit her words. She simply spoke each syllable clearly. "It carries authentication from the Department of Justice. Not a single pixel has been altered." The words fell like the final locking of a prison door. Foster staggered backward, hitting the wall behind him. His eyes darted wildly, like a trapped animal, veins bulging along his neck as if they might burst. Ava switched to the next slide. The screen showed two children, the sons of the man Foster had framed, standing in the visitation room of a jail. The younger child clutched his father's jacket, his face streaked with tears, unable to understand why his dad could not come home. Ava stared at that image for 1 second longer than usual. 1 second was enough for her own memories to surface. Memories of war's aftermath, of families broken in ways nothing could repair. She inhaled softly, then continued. The next slide displayed a data table. The man framed by Foster had spent 1.5 years behind bars for a crime he never committed. He lost his job, lost custody of his children, lost the only apartment he had. Ava spoke, and all of it began with one bag of white powder that Officer Foster introduced at the scene himself. Something cracked. Whether it was Foster's voice or something inside him shattering, no one could tell. He stammered, "You are destroying me." Ava met his eyes without the slightest tremor. "You destroyed yourself. I am only showing everyone what you did." The room erupted, not in shouts, but in the heavy sounds of fury and disbelief. Chairs scraped. Someone whispered a prayer. Dozens of phones lifted, capturing the moment that would be on every front page the next morning. In one last desperate act, Foster lunged forward as if to rip the USB from the machine. But a court security officer intercepted him halfway. And at that moment, everyone saw the stark contrast between the two figures before them, Ava steady and focused like an arrow, pointed directly at the center of truth. Foster panicked and, shaking like darkness, dragged unwillingly into the light. Ava placed her hand on the final case file. She knew opening it would mark the point of no return for Foster's life and career. But before she could speak, a profound stillness spread across the courtroom. No one moved. No one blinked. The truth was already too clear, and everyone understood Ava Morgan was not just an analyst, not just a data expert. She was someone far greater, someone Foster had never recognized. But he was about to, and once he did, nothing would ever be the same again. In the seconds following the video of planted evidence, the courtroom seemed to dissolve into a suffocating silence. Yet in the middle of that silence, Ava Morgan stood tall, one hand resting on the final case file, as if she were holding the weight of an inevitable ending. She didn't speak. She only inhaled slowly. But that single quiet moment made everyone feel that something far more devastating was about to be revealed. Ryan Foster understood that. He staggered backward as if every breath Ava took pushed him closer to the edge of a cliff. He had no arguments left, no fury to shout, with only raw panic. A man who had once used authority to silence entire blocks now could not find his own voice. A police officer who used to command a neighborhood now trembled in the very place he had sworn to keep order. But Ava still hadn't opened the final file. She looked at Foster, not with anger, but with sorrow for the innocent people who had suffered under him. Then she spoke in a low, slow voice, each word cutting straight through the room. The court will see that what you have done is not just numbers, not just statistics. It is families torn apart, children growing up without understanding why their fathers vanished, people labeled as criminals because of the color of their skin. The entire courtroom fell silent once more. But this time it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of realization. Ava opened the last file. Not a video, not a photograph. It was a pattern analysis she had built over months, a model showing that the misconduct in Foster's unit was never a series of isolated incidents. It was a system, a recognizable pattern repeated long enough to become habit. A model that would continue swallowing vulnerable people for years if no one spoke out. But just as she began to present, a sudden noise exploded at the back of the room, the violent scrape of a chair being shoved. Foster. He broke away from his position, breath-ragged eyes bloodshot, his fist clenched, as if he wanted to crush something invisible. Someone tried to hold him back, but he tore away, marching toward the witness stand with heavy steps like war drums. The entire room jolted to its feet. Some people screamed, others backed toward the exits. Cameramen swung their lenses to capture every second of his advance. But Ava did not move, did not blink, did not flinch. It was as if she had always known this moment would come. And Foster, consumed by pure reckless rage, swung his arm. The hiss of air sliced into the crack of flesh. The slap was so hard, Ava's head snapped to the side, her sleek black hair whipping off her shoulder. The microphone screeched as it clipped against her glasses. Someone shouted, "He attacked a witness." Another yelled, "Get court security." But it was too late, because Ava did not fall. She only paused for half a second. Half a second of absolute stillness. Half a second in which the entire courtroom felt time being strangled. Ava slowly lifted her hand, touching the burning streak on her cheek. Then she turned back to face Foster with a look entirely different from anything she had shown him since the hearing began. It was the gaze of someone no longer hiding her true power. A subtle shift came through her posture, barely noticeable, but enough to send chills through the nearest observers. Her shoulders lowered, her feet angled slightly, and her weight centered in the grounded stance of someone trained in the harshest environments. Foster didn't recognize it, but the audience did. Not with logic, but with instinct. Instinct that this woman was not fragile, not delicate. She was changing. Returning to who she truly was, someone Foster had never known, someone he should have feared. Ava spoke, her voice soft as a breath, but cold enough to raise goosebumps. "Officer Foster, you have gone far enough." And before anyone could reach them, Foster lunged again, this time with his arm raised high, aiming a blow that could have knocked anyone down. But Ava was not anyone. Time seemed to slow as Foster's arm began its descent. Ava pivoted slightly. Her arm shot out. And at the exact moment his hand cut through its arc, she caught his wrist with a strike that was swift, precise, and cold as a blade. Foster's mouth fell open. No one could comprehend what had just happened. But Ava knew. She had just taken 1 second to rewrite his entire future. And the second second was coming. Foster's arm froze in midair, stopped cold by Ava, as if his violent strike had collided with an invisible wall of steel. Just a second earlier, he believed that blow would silence her. Now his own hand was locked in place, unable to move even an inch. Foster's face twisted in disbelief. He had no idea what had just happened. He could not comprehend it. In his entire career as a police officer, no one had ever intercepted his strike mid-air with that kind of cold, precise speed. But Ava understood. She felt no fear, no panic, no pain. In that instant, every year of brutal training on the battlefield surged back through her. The empty hand combat drills with teammates twice her size, the life-or-death moments where she had to react faster than half a breath to survive. All of it moved through her body like an electric current, guiding every motion. The second arrived. Ava stepped forward half a pace and twisted Foster's wrist against the direction of his own momentum. A choked sound escaped his throat, not from pain, but from pure shock. He lost his balance, his entire body pitching forward. And in that same second, Ava struck the center of his chest so lightly the audience could barely see it yet, with pinpoint accuracy that knocked the air out of his lungs. Foster folded, dropping to his knees, eyes wide as if about to burst. No one could understand how such a soft movement could drop a 200-pound man like he had been hit with a sledgehammer. The third second hit like a thunderclap. Ava pivoted, shifted her weight, and drove her elbow upward into the underside of Foster's jaw. The strike was swift and clean, without an ounce of wasted motion. And Foster, who had once bragged about being the strongest man in his unit, collapsed onto the marble floor like a felled tree struck at its weak point. His body hit the ground with a heavy echoing thud. A woman screamed. A man whispered, "Dear God." The entire courtroom erupted. People shot out of their seats. Some staggered back as if witnessing something their eyes struggled to accept. A few reporters jolted so hard their pens dropped to the floor. Cameras fired non-stop flashes, streaking across the walls like lightning in a violent storm. But Ava simply stood tall, lowering her hand, with a calm so surreal it almost felt unreal, as if those 3 seconds were nothing more than a routine part of her day. She bent down to pick up the case file that had fallen when Foster charged. Her movements were slow, deliberate, nothing like the movements of someone who had just taken down the leader of a rapid response unit. When she rose, the microphone in front of her caught her voice again. Ava spoke her tone steady enough to chill the room. As I was stating, Your Honor, misconduct does not only appear in the data, it is clearly demonstrated in Officer Foster's actions. The packed courtroom felt suddenly breathless, as if no one dared inhale. A court security officer rushed over checking Foster's breathing. He was still alive, but completely unconscious. It was a scene that sent shivers through everyone. A large, muscular officer sprawled motionless on the floor, while the small woman before him stood firm like a pillar in a storm. Ava looked down at Foster not with triumph or anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew she had done nothing wrong. Someone who knew the world needed to witness what had just happened. Judge Cole shot up from her chair, her voice trembling. "Security, remove Officer Foster and call medical immediately." But the judge wasn't looking at Foster. She was looking at Ava, and she stared for a long time as if trying to reassess everything she thought she knew about the woman standing before her. A journalist whispered, "She is not just some expert." "No way. No one can do that," another replied. "Then who is she?" Ava heard both questions, and in that moment she knew the truth would not stay hidden much longer. But not yet. Ava adjusted the microphone once more. Her voice returned to its steady, unshaken tone. "We will continue with the presentation." A courtroom that had just witnessed 3 seconds of devastation now fell silent again, as though no one dared interrupt the woman standing there. No one in that room knew that the blow they had just witnessed would ripple far beyond the courtroom, would reach across the nation, and would shift the course of police reform. Ava knew, and Foster, lying unconscious on the marble floor, finally understood as well. But far too late. The sound of the courtroom doors closing behind the medical team carrying Foster out still echoed like the ceiling of a coffin, but Ava Morgan did not turn to look. She remained at the witness stand, shoulders straight, eyes focused on the documents before her, as if those 3 seconds that had stunned the entire nation had been nothing more than a small pause in a much longer presentation. Across the room, everyone's breath still hung halfway in their chests, suspended by the shock of what had just happened. Some reporters were still trembling, their cameras tilted off angle as they tried to steady themselves enough to film this historic moment. An older man, in a worn shirt, placed both hands on his head, blurting out almost unconsciously, "I have never seen anything like that in my life." The person beside him whispered, voice cracking, "Who is she?" "She is not an expert. She cannot be an ordinary person." But Ava had heard those questions for months, even before she stepped into this hearing. And as always, she did not answer. She knew that when the truth of who she really was finally came out, it had to arrive at the right moment, not too early, not too late. Every step she took, every word she spoke, every piece of evidence she revealed was a link in the chain of truth this society needed to confront. Taking Foster down was only one small part of a much larger picture. Ava stood before the screen where the next slide waited. Instead of projecting it immediately, she lifted her documents, turned a page, then looked directly at Judge Harriet Cole. Not angry, not triumphant, just a calm that made the skin on others' arms rise. "Your Honor, I will continue." Her voice was steady without a tremor, as if nothing unusual had just occurred. And that more than anything, deepened the silence in the room. Judge Cole nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Ava as if trying to understand how a woman who had just endured violence could remain so impossibly composed. Ava pressed the button. A new slide appeared, a city-wide map districts, glowing in different colors, pale blue for low misconduct, orange for moderate red for severe. And the district where Foster served was deep red. Ava stepped aside, pointing to the map. Over the past 7 years, the rate of unlawful force in Patrol Unit Number 3 has risen steadily, quarter by quarter. Not a spike. Not an accident, a pattern. And this pattern can only exist when protected for a long period of time. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A young lawyer jumped to her feet as if pulled by wires. She breathed hard, lowering her voice to avoid being reprimanded. No one reported it because they knew reporting it would not change anything. A veteran officer seated in the back row stared down at his hands as though finally realizing that what he had ignored for years had now rotted so badly it stank in front of him. Ava continued. These numbers show that the harm does not lie in isolated cases. It spreads like a disease. And when an officer like Foster is not held accountable, the entire system learns from that. She switched slides. Footage stitched together from public cameras, patrol car cameras, and hospital records. Every frame was a piece of evidence she had spent hundreds of hours retrieving, organizing, verifying. A brown-skinned woman shoved against a wall after simply asking why she was pulled over. A Latino man gripped so tightly his arm was dislocated. A 13-year-old boy interrogated like a criminal with no evidence at all. Each image triggered another gasp from the crowd. It was as if they were witnessing something everyone knew, yet had never dared face directly. Then Ava displayed the final chart, a red line representing Foster's unit. It climbed upward like a trail of blood across the pale gray graph, never dipping, not even for a single quarter. Ava spoke, her voice slower, heavier. We are not only speaking about misconduct, we are speaking about what happens when power is left unchecked. And when power has no boundaries, it will always target the weakest. A man pressed his hand to his mouth, eyes filling with tears. A young mother hugged her child tightly, as though something on the screen might leap out toward them. Judge Cole leaned back in her chair and exhaled sharply. And Ava. Ava knew this moment was her true purpose, forcing the entire room to confront a system they had always assumed was stable, always assumed was fair. Foster was no longer here, but his shadow clung to every number on the screen. Ava pressed the button. The slide vanished, replaced by a black screen. She looked directly at the judge, at the reporters, at the citizens holding their breath. The next section of this report will identify who allowed these actions to continue for so many years. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. No one breathed, because that sentence no longer targeted Foster. It targeted the entire machine behind him. The moment Ava's final sentence faded, the room seemed to sink into a deeper layer of silence. The air grew dense, so dense it felt like anyone could reach out and scoop the tension hanging beneath the ceiling. Every gaze from the public, the attorneys, the reporters, all the way to Judge Harriet Cole, locked on to the woman at the witness stand. Those eyes no longer held just shock at what she had revealed, but something sharper fear of whatever she was about to expose next. Ava understood that clearly. She inhaled softly, turning the final page of the thick case file, as though she were opening a door into a level of hell many inside this courtroom had worked hard to bury. The overhead lights struck the page, directly sharpening the bold text until it gleamed like blades waiting to cut through the surface of truth. Judge Cole shifted in her seat, leaning forward slightly. For the first time since the hearing began, fear appeared plainly on her face. Not fear of Ava, but fear of what Ava was about to identify the responsibility of high-ranking officials, the ones who had shielded Foster and an entire network of misconduct for years. Ava lifted the file and stepped forward, her voice low but resonant. The final section of this report identifies the individuals who repeatedly ignored complaints, altered records, or made evidence disappear regarding Patrol Unit Number 3. Several members of the police department's internal personnel stiffened. A man in a gray suit jerked upright as if struck in the back. A female officer in the front row clenched her hands so tightly her knuckles drained white. They knew what was coming. And the terrifying part was this: Ava had proof. She pressed the button to display the slide. The first name appeared, then the face, then the title, Deputy Chief of Internal Affairs, Mark Ellison. A ripple of shock tore through the room like a wave smashing against rock. Ellison, the head of internal investigations, the very person responsible for reviewing misconduct complaints, was the first name on her list of enablers. Ava continued. Over the past 6 years, Mr. Ellison closed more than 30 complaints directly tied to Officer Foster. All were marked insufficient evidence, despite public cameras having captured incidents or victims possessing hospital records documenting injuries. Ellison shot to his feet, voice shaking as he yelled, "You! Our twisting this internal affairs does not have authority to intervene at that level." Ava stared at him, unblinking. "But you did have the authority to delete the surveillance footage from the precinct on the evening of the 15th of June, 2 years ago." The recovered copy is in the hard drive I submitted to the court. A stunned cry broke from someone in the gallery. Ellison collapsed back into his seat, like a man whose legs had been cut out from beneath him. Judge Cole touched her temple, trying to hide her own jolt of reaction. Ava changed the slide, the second name, the third, the fourth. Each name landed like a strike against the system. A revelation. A blow tearing open walls of power long believed untouchable. A reporter whispered, "She is not just going after Foster, she is tearing into the foundation of the entire police department." The person beside him replied, voice trembling, "Does she even have the authority to do something like this?" The question hovered in the air. But the truth was clear. No one in the room knew who Ava really was. When the final slide appeared, Ava returned to the stand, her voice dropping a tone. And here is the conclusion. This pattern of misconduct cannot exist without a sheltering network stretching from command to internal oversight. This hearing is not merely to evaluate one man's behavior, it is to examine the way this entire system has operated for many years. No one moved, no one spoke, no one dared look at the person beside them. In that moment, Ava stood unmistakably as the one holding absolute control, not through violence, but through truth. She drew a slow breath and closed the file. A small sound, but enough to make several people flinch. And at that exact moment, the courtroom doors burst open. A court assistant hurried inside, rushing straight to Judge Cole and whispering urgently into her ear. The judge's face shifted color. For the first time since the hearing began, she looked at Ava with an expression that was no longer doubt, no longer admiration, but recognition. She spoke, her voice more serious than ever before. Ms. Morgan, you are Ava, lifted her head, her eyes calm enough to send a shiver through the room. The secret was about to break, and everyone was only one breath away from it. Ava Morgan stood at the witness stand, her gaze still and dark like a midnight lake moments before a storm. Judge Harriet Cole had not yet recovered from the shock of whatever the court assistant had whispered into her ear. Her expression wavered as though the entire reality unfolding before her had shifted its shape in an instant. And Ava knew the moment she had been waiting for, the moment this entire room would have no choice but to face the truth, had finally come. Ms. Morgan, Judge Cole began, her voice slowing because she herself could not believe what she was asking, "Are you?" But Ava did not answer immediately. She stepped forward half a pace, placed her hand on the wooden stand, and bowed her head slightly, like someone preparing to spell out a truth everyone should have known long ago. The entire courtroom held its breath, each inhale suspended in the air. Ava felt her own heartbeat slow, steady, firm, like the cadence of her steps, back when she still wore a uniform on the battlefield. At last, she lifted her head. Her voice was calm, but carried through the entire room. "I am a federal congresswoman representing the state of Illinois, a member of the Judiciary Oversight Committee, and the documents I presented here today were authorized by the government for investigation." No one breathed. No one reacted. A tremor rippled through the courtroom. A reporter slipped backward into his seat from pure shock. A female attorney raised her hand to her mouth, eyes widening as if they might burst. A police officer seated near the wall sagged as if drained of all strength. Ava Morgan, the woman they thought was simply a data analyst, was, in truth, one of the most powerful figures in Congress. Not just powerful in title, but powerful in investigative authority, access to classified records, and the ability to drag even the highest-ranking officials into the light of evidence. Judge Cole froze for several seconds, then inhaled deeply, steadying her voice. "You, Miss Morgan? Why did you not reveal your identity from the beginning?" Ava looked directly at her, her black eyes deep but softening for a brief moment. "Because I wanted the truth to be judged on its own, not on my position. And because I knew if someone like Foster knew who I was beforehand, he never would have exposed his true nature right here in this courtroom." A ripple of disbelief swept through the gallery. Ava was not surprised. She knew they would be shocked. She knew they would ask why a congresswoman stood alone in the eye of a storm. But what they did not know was that Ava had prepared for this day for months, that every file she examined, every video she restored, every testimony she recorded had been part of a larger truth. Ava continued, her voice stronger, "And if I announced from the start that I was a congresswoman, every person on the list I presented would have begun delaying altering records or intimidating witnesses. I needed them to be complacent. I needed them to believe I was only a regular analyst. I needed them to expose themselves." One sentence yet, it pierced through rows of officials from the Chicago Police Department, each wearing a different shade of guilt or fear. Some bowed their heads. Some flushed red with shame. Some trembled, wondering if their names were next, because they knew that a congresswoman could investigate far beyond what Ava had shown. At the back of the courtroom, the doors burst open. 2 federal agents entered dressed in black suits with gold badges pinned to their jackets. They walked straight to the table of Mark Ellison, the Deputy Chief of Internal Affairs, the man Ava had just exposed for erasing evidence. One agent presented an arrest warrant. Ellison pressed his lips together, trying to stand, but his legs shook violently. "You are being detained under order of the Department of Justice in an active federal investigation into police misconduct concealment. One agent," read his voice perfectly steady. Ellison collapsed like a severed sandbag. He looked at Ava with a mixture of hatred and despair before being escorted out in a suffocating silence. A wave of invisible force swept from the back of the courtroom toward the witness stand. Cover-ups were no longer theoretical. They were being arrested right in front of everyone. Judge Cole tightened her grip on the gavel, though her hand had stopped trembling. She understood clearly when a congresswoman stood before the court and presented the truth as Ava had. The judge in her own courtroom was no longer the most powerful person there. Ava opened the final page in her file, revealing a consolidated report showing that the misconduct extended far beyond Foster, far beyond Ellison, and deep into the system itself. Her voice slowed, but did not weaken. Misconduct exists when individuals act, but corruption exists when others protect them. Today, we are not just clarifying the actions of one man. We are questioning the way this entire system has operated. The courtroom tightened again, packed but breathless. Out in the hallway, the noise of media exploded. They already knew Ava was a congresswoman. That information spread like wildfire. Reporters crowded the doorway, raising microphones and cameras toward the glass. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd had begun to gather. No one in that room needed to look to know the country was shaking. Ava slowly closed the file and placed it on the stand, as though completing a critical chapter of a battle she had carried for months. Judge Cole looked around at the faces torn between fear and awakening. Then she turned back to Ava, not with suspicion, now not with hesitation, but with respect. "Ms. Morgan," she said, voice low but firm, "you have changed the entire course of this hearing." Ava bowed her head slightly, her voice soft, yet resounding. "Not just this hearing, Your Honor, but everything that happens after today. Judge Cole understood. The attorneys understood. The reporters understood. And those who had suffered police brutality sitting in the public rows understood more than anyone. Ava was not merely exposing misconduct. She was opening the door to a historic reform. At last, Ava stepped away from the stand. She walked between the silent rows, and every person turned to watch her as if witnessing someone who no longer belonged to ordinary power structures. They saw in her not just a congresswoman, not just a former soldier, not just a data investigator, but a force. A small woman who had dared confront rotting power with nothing more than truth, calm resolve, and courage. When the courtroom doors opened, the roar of the crowd outside crashed in like a tidal wave. Then came the hundreds of microphones, hundreds of questions, hundreds of eyes. Ava drew a deep breath and stepped forward, not as someone who had defeated a corrupt officer, but as someone who had forced an entire system to begin changing. Her fight had only just begun. But today, in this very courtroom, Ava Morgan had proven one thing: no power is greater than truth. And no one can stop a person who stands for what is right. From the perspective of an expert in systemic accountability, Ava Morgan's story shows that the truth always exists, waiting only for someone with enough resolve to bring it into the light. The courage of a single individual can force an entire structure to change. If you believe that justice cannot be built on silence, please like and subscribe to help spread this message, and leave a short comment. Stand up.